I spent the first hours of 1918 in a French brothel. However, it is only right to point out that this was strictly in an official capacity. Suitably lubricated by the French undertaker's wine, a group of our gunners wanted to crown their New Year celebrations with a visit to the Temple of Venus. There they met a like-minded group of Bavarian soldiers, rather full of Munich beer, who, according to tradition, were in the habit of rounding off a jolly evening out with a first-class pub fight. In the upper Bavarian Alps, a Saturday night without a free-for-all did not really count. Beer mugs were used as weapons, and gashed heads, broken noses and bruised bodies were a familiar sight and a source of steady income for the local doctor. So a battle royal ensued between our Alsatian gunners and the Bavarian Highlanders. In the end, nobody knew what it had all been about. Chairs were broken and used as weapons. Tables were hurled through the air and smashed against the wall mirrors, so essential in the furnishing of such an establishment. When the Br0thels tried to separate the fighting cocks, they received rough treatment, including black eyes and bruises. The orderly of the medical corps tried to intervene, and he too got a thrashing. The only reasonable thing to do was for me to join forces with the MO of the Bavarian battalion, to sew and bandage up the brothel heroes, and to smooth things over with the ladies. Next morning, our joiners and saddlers came to try to repair the broken furniture. It was really only junk anyway. Madame the proprietress carefully avoided telling the military police, fearing that her business would be declared out of bounds to the German troops, as this would have meant bankruptcy and loss of livelihood for her. Our CO, however, had the chaps put on a charge, and a few hours' square bashing and arms drill did them a lot of good. The question of sexual relationships between the young, and often not so young, German soldiers and French and Belgian women was a rather difficult one to reconcile with the strict rules and regulations. Our frontline soldiers came into contact only very spasmodically with the opposite sex. The country was completely denuded of its male and female civilian population for miles around, and their only sight of women was the pictures of pin-up girls, which they tore out of magazines sent to them by their friends, or which they bought in the kiosks immediately behind the front lines. The walls of the dugouts and gun emplacements were plastered with pictures of young, seductive girls. Whilst they were never completely nude, they were revealing enough to bring the young soldier's blood near to boiling point. A high-ranking officer made a surprise visit to a battery position, where he found the walls covered with this kind of picture. I watched him and was rather surprised that this middle-aged man was much more interested in the pin-up girls than the serious, though admittedly unromantic firing charts. Even though we were also men after all, curiously enough, most of us doctors were immune to the effects of these pictures on our sexual desire. I discussed the phenomenon with several of my colleagues, and they all agreed with me. Probably we knew the reality that lay behind this kind of posed picture, though personally I do not like this kind of image or pornographic books and magazines. However, I honestly believe that they are a necessary evil for large sections of society of all ranks. They seem to fill a gap in the mental structure of our society, and to condemn them out of hand is nonsense. In fact, appearing as an expert witness many years later, I was astounded when I had to listen to a learned judge talking about them as though they were the work of the devil. I wondered whether his lordship himself enjoyed them behind closed doors. The Army Medical Corps Command gave these matters a lot of thought. Millions of young men were involved, and it was their task to keep up both the physical and mental strength of the troops. One way out was the establishment of official brothels, but these were few and far between, and a long way behind the actual battle zone. We knew how sailors on the great battleships and male prisoners reacted to having sedatives mixed in their food, but it was feared that this might diminish the reactions and alertness of the fighting men. I am afraid that these problems were never solved in the course of the Great War. Deeply traumatic battles causing death and injury to young men were interspersed with long periods of boredom and waiting for things which never actually happened. When a fighting unit returned from combat and came into contact again with civilians, their dreams were shattered. Instead of the voluptuous virgins of dazzling beauty as promised to pious Muslims, they found ugly, dirty, worn-out, middle-aged whores, who in no way resembled the gorgeous pictures of the pin-up girls. The oldest prostitute I met was a woman over 70 with lice in her hair. When they did meet a good-looking young woman, it was amazing how the red-blooded young German soldiers could restrain themselves from committing acts of terror, but their discipline was of a high order. This was in contrast to that of the Congolese French troops whom Poincaré sent into the Ruhr 5 years after the war to squeeze millions of marks for reparation from an already exsanguinated Germany. There was no fraternization, strictly speaking, between German soldiers and the French or Belgian civilians. Instead, there were many examples of paternization and maternization. Some troops had been kept in the same place for years, and when the order came for them to leave, really heartbreaking scenes took place between the departing soldiers and the women and children they had to leave behind. Later, at the end of the war, when the German armies retreated in full order, many French women and their children left with them, sitting on top of the ammunition or provision carts. They were more afraid of what their own countrymen would do after the Germans departed, as they risked being beaten up, having their hair cut off and being put, so to speak, in the village stocks. A set of rather complicated circumstances arose in one of the units I looked after when it came to light that a soldier had fathered babies by both a mother and her daughter. Poor, frail humanity. The enemy was of course aware that there were storm clouds building ahead of the mighty German offensive in the spring of 1918, so they tried to find out what the German plans were. We all knew that spy rings existed and were warned to guard our tongues and to report any suspicious approaches from any quarter. I found myself billeted near Lille in the house of a high-ranking French officer, who was doubtless doing his best for his country on the other side of the barricades. The house gave out an aura of chastity and respectability and seemed almost like a nunnery. Every wall was adorned with pictures of the absent owner, his father, and, presumably, his grandfather, all resplendent in their uniforms. They stared down from the walls like watchdogs, waiting ready to jump out of their frames on anyone who dared to violate the sanctity of the house. My middle-aged hostess could hardly be said to be attractive. However, her reserve gave her an air of dignity, and all she ever deigned to say to me was, "Bonsoir, monsieur le docteur," to which I replied, "Bonsoir, madame." Late one night she asked me into her apartment because she felt ill. I found her in bed and she complained of all sorts of aches and pains, all at the same time. During the examination she suddenly embraced me passionately. I could not help comparing myself with the biblical Joseph in Egypt, and Potiphar's wife and I became equally anxious to extricate myself from the situation. As I detached myself from her clinging arms, I saw the photograph of her stern-looking husband standing on her bedside table. I pointed out my position as an enemy of France, her country, and spoke to her of her husband who, God willing, would eventually return to her. This had the opposite effect to the one I intended and excited her still more, so that she bemoaned her solitary state, her yearning for sexual fulfillment and her empty days and nights. I regarded myself as somewhat compromised. Remembering the end of Joseph's adventure, he was cast into prison, and I remained unmoved. This produced a complete volte-face. Now she rained abuse on me and called me all the names under the sun, including that of a heartless Boche. In view of my status as a doctor, I thought the right thing to do was to ask for a new billet, but when the adjutant of my unit insisted on my giving a reason for this request, I gave a tactful version of what had occurred. Laughing heartily, however, he told me that they knew all about this nymphomaniac, and that I was not the first, nor would I be the last of her victims. This took me down a peg or two, as I had flattered myself that it was my personal attractiveness that she could not resist. However, on hearing that she had called me a Boche, the adjutant became furious and even talked of informing the military police of what he deemed a serious affront to an officer. However, he abandoned the idea when I pointed out how these undignified revelations would look in court. Then another thought crossed our minds. Might this woman have anything to do with the spy rings of which we had been warned? The adjutant rang the security officer at HQ and told him what had happened, and sure enough, they already had her under observation. I shudder to think what would have happened to me if I had fallen for her. When I heard that my good landlady had been arrested, I felt even more deflated by the idea that the real intention of this shrewd mockingbird really had nothing to do with her infatuation for me. In reality, she was just a decoy, using old tricks to seduce German officers and then to compromise, and finally to blackmail them into giving away military secrets. It should be noted that the exact origin of the word Boche is obscure. The term was later also applied to the Germans by the British in a derogatory sense, as though the word Hun was not enough. The spring of 1918 was approaching, and with it hopes were rising among the German soldiers that the bogged-down armies would soon be on the move to bring about a speedy end to the war. They saw large forces assembling. These had been freed from their commitments on the Eastern Front and brought with them Austrian troops with their celebrated and feared heavy Austrian howitzers. One might say that as a doctor, I was in a rather detached position from which to observe the preparations for the big German spring offensive. New roads were built by hundreds of thousands of mainly Russian prisoners, together with those from Britain, France, Romania, Italy, and all the other nationalities which had come into contact with the Kaiser's army. The deception practiced on the enemy artillery observers worked to perfection. Half the new German large and small caliber batteries were kept constantly on the move, firing a few shots into enemy territory at night. When, next morning, British or French reconnaissance aircraft flew over to photograph the new battery position, there it was, or at least that was where it seemed to be, though it actually consisted of farm cart wheels and wooden beams, all enticingly semi-camouflaged. The British artillery would open up on these dummies, only to find that the following night a new battery would pop up unscathed a few hundred yards away from the original. These conceits went on for weeks, and especially in those parts of the front from which no real attack was planned. The enemy became restless and wanted to find out more about the troops occupying the sector opposite. So the Germans did not exchange the old troops for new ones, who might have given the game away were they to have been captured subsequently. The field batteries stood fully loaded and aimed at points where the enemy was expected to go over the top to reconnoitre in strength. Our gunners stood ready to pull the firing lanyards at any time of day or night to launch the first shells whenever they saw the right signal. These signals were multicoloured very lights shot from the advance observation posts. Even the colour sequences of the very lights were changed on a daily basis to fox the enemy observers. The heavy guns of my battalion had been tested on special artillery ranges to correct possible faults, resulting in deviation from their intended true course. Every 2 or 3 hours, messages with meteorological data came through with the latest atmospheric pressure readings and the exact wind conditions, that is, its direction and speed. So everything was being made ready for the big attack on which the outcome of the war depended. I had been hoping to go into battle with my old comrades, but a few days before, let us call it A-Day, I received orders to report to the CO of a battalion of infantry stormtroopers. They were preparing to assault the enemy's forward positions to break through and to clear a path into the enemy hinterland for our infantry divisions to follow. My successor had already arrived. He was some years older than me and had previously practiced as a children's doctor in Hamburg. Fresh into army service, all he knew of the war came from newspaper reports or crude cinema reel footage. I had to take leave of my CO, who had become a close friend, and I also wanted to introduce him to the man who was stepping into my shoes. The new man had never sat on a horse, and so we had to use a small dog cart to which was harnessed my own charger, originally a cart horse, by the way. The quartermaster wanted me to use a pangy horse at first, but these were wild beasts prone to biting and kicking anyone they were not used to, and always full of fleas. So I turned the offer down. We drove along a road jammed with marching columns, supply convoys and ambulances returning with wounded soldiers. Just when we had reached the centre of a village, the Royal Flying Corps paid a surprise visit, flying low and dropping most unpleasant Easter eggs. I turned the cart into a field, and we drove as fast as our good horse could pull us until we reached a type of solid-looking outhouse, behind which we took shelter and waited for the end of the bombardment. However, the high-pitched whistle of bombs racing towards us, ear-splitting explosions, rat-a-tat-tat of the machine guns, shouting and crying of the men, dust clouds from masonry collapsing into the streets, crash-bang-wallop of anti-aircraft guns barking furiously at the aeroplanes, pom-pom-pom of cannons firing tracer bullets, and finally the plunging of a British aircraft into a field close by where it burst into flames, all gave my colleague a terrifying first impression of war. He began trembling. His face became ash-grey. He was bathed in sweat and actually started to be sick. One really ought to be broken into the horrors of frontline life more gradually, rather than being subjected to its full fury in just a few seconds. I did my best to comfort the poor man. To try to calm him down, I told him that the incident he had just witnessed was really most unusual. I hoped that he believed me at the time. He would find out for himself in due course that I was a liar. Nevertheless, we had to go on to the advanced command post of the battalion, which meant returning to the now burning village. There we found quite a number of casualties and were able to lend a helping hand to the surgeons stationed at the first aid post. So my successor passed his baptism of fire. The new battalion to which I had been attached consisted of hand-picked young men. Each was a first-class athlete who had been trained fully in swift, silent movement and how to throw hand grenades with deadly accuracy. Instead of rifles per se, they had 12-shot automatic pistols mounted on wooden stocks. By means of a clever device, the weapon could be fixed onto the end of the holder, thus turning it into an easy-to-use rifle. Spades with keenly sharpened edges were used as sidearms, and these inflicted terrible wounds. The only thing a French or British soldier could do when attacked by these devils was to throw down his weapons and put up his hands as quickly as he could. He had met the first 11th of the Kaiser's army. The German attack was on two sides. The first was opposite the British Fifth Army, through which the stormtroopers broke on the 21st of March 1918. The second attack was launched on the 9th of April, and my new battalion was part of that spearhead. After a short but terribly intensive artillery bombardment, they smashed into an unfortunate division of Portuguese troops who should have been replaced by a British Army unit the previous day. The battalion raced in. My orders were to go with the first wave and to establish forward dressing stations in the wake of the advancing troops. As luck would have it, in a concrete machine gun post, I found an abandoned Portuguese dressing station with a brand new sterilizing instrument made in England. Just what the doctor ordered, so to say. I snaffled it straight away and carried it out in its brown canvas case against my stomach. After about 100 yards, a shell burst quite close to me. A large splinter of metal flew in my direction and promptly struck the metal sterilizer which I was carrying. The machine stopped the impact, and whilst it received a serious dent, it undoubtedly saved my life at the price of a few bruises near my navel. I still cherish the sterilizer and use it quite often in my practice. The war was over for the poor Portuguese soldiers. They emerged from their dugouts in droves with their hands up. But as soon as the NCOs of the German Engineers Corps spotted them, they were given shovels and ordered to start repairing the roads. Others were used as stretcher bearers and had to carry their own wounded to my forward dressing stations. The Germans had hardly any casualties. The Portuguese looked rather strange in their light blue uniforms and corrugated tin hats, which looked like dustbin lids. From an aesthetic point of view, the French steel helmet was undoubtedly the finest. The British had what we called upside-down soup plates, and the German steel helmet was modelled on that of a medieval knight. Our good old Pickelhaube was a leather helmet with a brass cone on top. It was obviously designed to withstand sword slashes in cavalry attacks in the 19th century, but was utterly useless in modern war conditions. It gave no protection against rifle bullets or shell splinters. On the contrary, pieces of stiff leather or brass ornament were frequently found in the brains of wounded soldiers, and the consequences of acute brain and tissue infection and rapid death were all too often apparent. As I have said already, the generals were usually living in the past and fighting previous wars, not the present one. From a psychological viewpoint, a soldier wearing a steel or even a leather helmet has an instinctive feeling that his head is being protected. In his subconscious mind, his main concern is to protect his brain, leaving the other parts of his body as of secondary importance. The assault battalion stormed on, only to be fired at occasionally, and by German guns. This was because a stupid artillery observer who ought to have been with the most forward troops had lagged behind and thought the soldiers he saw through his glasses were British or Portuguese. This brought forth a monumental volume of curses and name-calling from those affected. I followed behind the leading wave of troops with my stretcher-bearers and medical orderlies. Someone had found a whole column of fully fueled British Army lorries. Our battalion platoons swept through the countryside without finding a single enemy soldier. The way to the Channel ports lay open. The road which led through the forest of Hazebrook to St Omer and Calais was ours. Companies of our battalion's stormtroopers passed through the wood, and a few units of the follow-up division emerged on the northwest edge of the forest. However, many of the rest simply failed to appear or turned up unfit for combat, that is, dead drunk. They had found huge stocks of wine and spirits. Each man had taken a bottle of whiskey or the like, and downed it eagerly, as if it were lemonade or ersatz coffee. Thus the German offensive had ground to a halt on our part of the front at least, not due to lack of fighting spirit, but to a superabundance of Scottish drinking spirit instead. This was certainly something Ludendorff and his staff officers had not foreseen. Now, too late, they gave orders for all the wine vats to be hacked open and their contents emptied onto the ground. Whiskey and liqueur bottles had to be broken one by one, with an officer and at least 3 men, plus a machine gun present, to ensure that not another German soldier got a further taste of the stuff. Near Merville on the River Lys we came across a British aerodrome. We found dozens of aircraft which had been piled up and deliberately set on fire, having been doused in petrol and torched. The German advance had been so rapid that there had not even been time for the aeroplanes to take off and get airborne. A little further down the road was a large and deserted British Army Medical Corps depot. The officers and their orderlies had also apparently left in a tearing hurry because we found half-eaten food on their plates. In the depot itself, we discovered crate after crate of dressing materials, bandages by the thousand, real cotton and masses of gauze. For months, the German doctors had been obliged to use crepe paper bandages to dress wounds. The crepe paper was about as useful as lavatory paper would have been, and lasted about as long. Instead of cotton wool, we used a kind of cellulose paper, which also got soaked in no time with blood and pus, and just dissolved into a wet, stinking mass. In one corner of the depot I found innumerable boxes of rubber gloves, a distant memory for us German medical officers. Rubber hardly existed anymore in blockade-bound Germany, and the German Navy even had a large unarmed mercantile submarine built to fetch rubber, copper and other essential war materials, such as wolfram and the like from countries like the USA, or to pick them up from neutral vessels in remote spots on the world's oceans. As a point of interest, its name was the Deutschland, and its captain was one Herr König. German surgeons had to tackle dirty and infected wounds without any covering for their own hands. Their only means of pre- and post-operative scrubbing up was a kind of sand soap, that is 1 part soap to 3 parts sand. What we found at the depot were thousands of pairs of splendid rubber gloves, there for the taking. I ran into the road and halted ammunition carts coming back from the forward firing lines. I told the NCO in charge of the windfall gifts I had discovered and what I wanted, and he agreed to help in the rescue. However, when I went back to the treasure cave, I found dozens of soldiers amusing themselves by blowing up the gloves and pretending they were balloons. At my old garrison town of Freiburg, I had learnt some choice barrack square language and how to bellow orders, and I put this to good use by throwing the men out and saving the gloves. During the first few days of the German spring offensive, we found hardly any British forces to oppose our onslaught, other than a few companies of bicycle-mounted troops. Our stormtroopers had overrun the British artillery positions, and now we found the heavy howitzers which had made our lives so miserable. Pieces of field artillery were still aimed at the German lines, but now they were deserted. Some of them were turned round by our own specially trained gunners and made to fire at their previous masters. An exact replica of one of these big guns is at the Artillery Memorial at Hyde Park Corner in London. By now the British had brought up their last reserves. These were former clerks, cooks and batmen who would have been no match for the German soldiers had the latter been sober. As it was, due to the alcohol infusion, the front froze again. Slow-moving infantry divisions took over, and I had to stay with them. It was quite a while since I had served with the so-called Queen of the Battlefield, namely the infantry. By rights, these poor chaps should have been called the Cinderella troops, as they had to endure all the hardships and privations going, while the stormtroopers were treated like football stars. The latter lived in comfortable quarters, travelled to the playing fields in buses, did their jobs, and then disappeared again. It was left to the poor footsloggers to dig in, deal with counterattacks, and endure the vengeful artillery fire of the enemy. The stormtroopers themselves were so fit and well-trained, and had developed such a high level of teamwork that their casualties were almost nil. They moved like snakes over the ground. They were well camouflaged and made use of every piece of cover, so that they offered virtually no target for enemy fire. When they did reach the barbed wire entanglements of the positions opposite, they had special grenades which they used to take out the defences. Dangerous folk to encounter indeed. It was left to the rank and file of the infantry to endure attacks by low-flying enemy aircraft, tanks and flamethrowers. It was horrendous to see the poor devils literally converted into burning torches, crushed flat by the broad tracks of the tanks, or blown to pieces by hand grenades in their dugouts. I had established a first aid post near Br0thels in Flanders. The British attacked with tanks followed by infantry. The German defensive tactics had changed. Instead of clinging on to every foot of trench, they just evacuated the forward positions, and before the enemy had time to consolidate his newly won line, a counter-attack would be launched to turn the tables. However, we were overrun in our little dugout, and the British ordered us to take off our belts and wait until they could escort us to the rear. In other words, we had become prisoners of war, guarded by 3 Tommies and their machine gun. After about an hour, though, the Germans counter-attacked and we were free again. Into the bargain, we now had 3 Scottish prisoners of war. Our men were very curious to know what they wore underneath their kilts. The opposing armies became bogged down again. Fresh trenches were dug, more barbed wire entanglements set up, so that these horrible devices were used again. In my position as MO, I had to see to it that there were latrines and that lime was handy. It was a fact of life that with shells exploding all around, one often exposed oneself to danger when answering the call of nature. The regimental commander called me to his headquarters and showed me an order from the Director General of Medical Services, posting me to a hospital situated far behind our lines. Obviously, the employment agency for probationer surgeons had decided that I deserved a break from my frontline duties. The huge hospital to which I was posted was in the most delightful setting, right in the heart of Ardennes, and consisted of several large units. When I arrived there, I found that my luggage, which I had sent in advance, had disappeared. As this was the case, I had to report to the CO in my dirty, shabby uniform, which I had worn for so long in the trenches with the frontline troops. My trunk was found in southern Germany and returned to me about 3 weeks later. The Army Medical Corps Major had never seen any fighting, and his uniform looked spick and span. He kindly directed me to the officers' mess, as I had not eaten for over 30 hours. An orderly in spotless whites received me and led me to a table covered with an immaculately clean cloth. Then a Lucullan feast cooked by the chef of one of the most famous restaurants in Strasbourg was placed before me. As I tucked greedily into the food, I was unable to suppress guilty thoughts of the front-line soldiers eating horsemeat or meagre rations of Hindenburg fat made from turnips. After dinner, I found my new colleagues. They were all elderly men and were engaged in a game of skittles in a purpose-built bowling alley, probably constructed to imitate the thunder of wartime cannon fire. The doctors greeted me most warmly and even lent me a razor to shave off my 3-day-old beard. Then the chief instructed me as to my duties. The hospital was a small general one for inpatient cases or for minor surgery, for which a consultant surgeon had to be called from the nearest larger unit. There were many sawmills in the area, and quite a number of workers presented with deep cuts on their hands. An occasional case of appendicitis was also admitted, and here the consulting surgeon gave me the chance of operating under his guidance. A physician would be called in for medical cases, because it so happened that all the resident doctors were specialists in psychiatry. The large central part of the building was a mental hospital, housing hundreds of patients suffering acute psychosis, shell shock, and other psychiatric ailments. The block was staffed entirely by monks of a nursing order, each one a powerfully built giant at least 6 feet tall. The patients were kept in large wards. Unruly patients were often put into padded cells, where they stood in an agitated state, talking constantly to themselves or to people or things which existed only in their imagination. Others had hallucinations, still reliving the horrors of an artillery bombardment or gas attack. They covered their faces with their hands as if to protect themselves from shell splinters. Others would shout out for their gas masks, which they could not find, and still others heard voices under their bed covers threatening them with death. The lack of modern drugs and methods such as shock therapy compelled the doctors to put some violent patients into straitjackets of strong canvas, fastened at the back by leather straps. These had long sleeves which crossed over the chest, and were also secured at the back by leather straps. One man pleaded constantly with an imaginary foe not to run his bayonet through his stomach. Other patients would be put for hours into lukewarm baths to calm them down. The giant monks stood in the corners of the wards on constant guard duty, watching every movement of the inmates. Most had lost control of their body functions and were doubly incontinent. They wet their beds and would smear excrement over their faces. Others stared blankly into space for hours, days, or even weeks, and needed force-feeding. I would first have to call a warder whenever I walked through the long corridors and wanted to enter a ward. The warder would open the door for me with a key which he carried on a steel chain around his waist. The doors would close automatically, and nobody could leave without the help of a warder in possession of the right key. Quite often I would be called at night to one of the patients, and would have to walk for almost a mile through half-lit corridors, never knowing whether there was a maniac around the next corner ready to attack me with some kind of weapon. It took a certain amount of nerve not to become a psychopath oneself. Even to this day, in remote corners of the countries involved in hostilities, I am convinced that mental hospitals still house incurable cases of mental disorder caused by the horrors of the Great War. The third block was surrounded by high barbed wire fences. The only patients there were quite normal-looking females who had been picked up by the military police in the act of prostitution and found to be suffering from venereal disease. This so-called Damenschloss ladies' castle came under my care. A specialist in venereal disease gave me thorough instruction on how to treat these cases. If in doubt, I had to contact him, otherwise he would call only once every 2 weeks. There was a small story associated with the staffing of this unit. At first, nursing sisters from a religious order were in charge. However, they were quite unable to cope with this bunch of completely unruly women from the dregs of society. The ladies beat up the sisters, so the authorities had to bring in female warders from German women's prisons who knew how to control them. A well-meaning German women's association at first insisted that the girls should be treated only by female doctors, but the patients beat them up as well. Thus, male doctors had to take over, and so I became one of the unfortunates to whom this onerous duty was entrusted. One woman was like the gypsy girl Carmen in Bizet's opera. Wild and completely uncontrollable, she was suffering from the most dangerous and contagious form of syphilis. She quarrelled with everyone and fought constantly with her fellow inmates. Skin and hair would fly. A few years earlier, in 1910, Ehrlich had produced a biochemical anti-syphilitic drug called Salvarsan, and this was considered to be the best remedy available. However, our Carmen lady vigorously refused treatment of any kind, and when I tried to explain that the treatment was for her own good, she laughed and taunted me, calling me every name under the sun, culminating in the word Sale Bosch. She worked herself into a towering rage and finally spat in my face, to the great amusement of the other girls who were looking on. I snapped at this point and hit her left cheek such a smack that it spun her around. This did the trick. She calmed down, and the other girls saw not to trifle with me. The matron of the female warders came to me to express her gratitude for an act which had put a stop to the girls' unbearable behaviour. Not so the chief, to whom I had to report the incident. He carpeted me to such an extent that I have not forgotten it to this day. He reminded me of the fact that we were members of the finest profession in the world, and that we had to treat our patients with respect, regardless of their standing, behaviour, or nationality. It was our duty to give them proper medical treatment, even under extreme provocation. Finally, I was told to remember that most of the inmates of the ladies' castle had the mentality and intelligence of 6-year-old children, and many were psychopaths. In view of my war record and the nervous strain caused by it, he would not start disciplinary procedure against me. It was true that since the early days of the war, I was mostly on my own, in the ambulance train, with the artillery or in the trenches, and my orders had been obeyed without question. Here I was a somewhat insignificant member of the team, and was finding it difficult to adapt to this role. Furthermore, my main interest was in surgery, and many of my ancestors had been surgeons right back to the 17th century. I was not best suited to this type of work. After a few weeks, I felt that I needed a fresh start elsewhere, and after a number of strings were pulled, I got a posting to the Air Force. However, just before I left, we received a message announcing that we were to receive a dreadful VIP visit. It would either be from Her Majesty the Empress or one of the Grand Duchesses. So the hospital had to be scrubbed from stem to stern. This included the bedside tables and their contents, bedpans and spittoons, which HRH might be especially interested to see. The patients were rather annoyed by all this upheaval, and one of them, a Berlin boy, threatened to use the word arsch were he to be asked on which part of his anatomy he had been wounded. This was deemed to be unsuitable for royal ears, and his threat caused much anxiety among the medical staff. Her Royal Highness the Grand Duchess of Hesse duly arrived, and the chief and I conducted her on a ward round. The patients had to lie to attention in their beds, and did not like that at all. The high-born lady went to each of them and asked a few irrelevant questions. Most probably she had to perform this duty almost every day of the week and was bored stiff. Then she approached the bed of my enfant terrible. He smiled, and I feared the worst. Perhaps to change the theme, and in contrast with her earlier questions to other soldiers, she asked where he was born and whether he was married and had children. To my great relief, she then moved on, and our young man looked rather crestfallen. Of course, she was not allowed near the mental hospital and was not informed that we had, horror of horrors, a ladies' castle in one of the blocks.